Grief is a strange thing. One moment, it crushes you under the weight of what's been lost. The next, it tricks you into believing nothing has changed. Some mornings, Ethan still woke up expecting a text from Jake. The usual nonsense, a meme, some half-baked idea about quitting their jobs and road tripping across the country. But the phone stayed silent. Jake was gone, and no amount of wishful thinking would change that. The accident had been quick. Too quick. The kind where no one gets to say goodbye. A patch of black ice, a guardrail, and a plunge into darkness. No body recovered. The river had swallowed him whole, and all that was left was the wreckage of his car, crushed beyond recognition. The funeral had been closed casket. A formality, really. Jake's mother still clung to the idea that he might be out there, lost, maybe injured. But Ethan had seen the wreck. No one was walking away from that. Sleep became a problem after that. Late nights blurred into early mornings, and most of his time was spent lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for his brain to shut off. That's why, when his phone buzzed at 2:43 a.m., he was still awake. At first, he didn't bother checking. Probably some junk notification, another useless email. But then the screen caught his eye. The name, Jake. The air in the room thickened. The kind of pressure that settles in the chest, tightening like a fist around the lungs. A mistake, it had to be. Some old message that never sent, some kind of glitch. But then his stomach dropped as he read the words. Miss me? The phone nearly slipped from his grip. He blinked, shook his head. A prank. Someone had to be screwing with him. But who? The number was Jake's. Unchanged, the same one he had dialed 100 times before. For a long moment, he simply stared at it. His fingers hovered over the screen, unsure of what to do. Respond? Ignore it? Delete it and pretend it never happened? He locked the phone and tossed it onto his nightstand, rolling over in bed, willing himself to forget. Another buzz, then another. His heart pounded as he reached for the phone again. Remember that time we snuck into the old mill? Ethan's breath hitched. That wasn't something just anyone would know. They'd been 14, fueled by boredom and an overabundance of teenage invincibility. The mill had been condemned for years, its doors bolted shut, but Jake had found a way in through a broken window. They'd spent hours inside, daring each other to go deeper into the darkened ruins. No one else had been there. No one else would know. A cold sweat broke out along the back of his neck. His hands trembled slightly as he typed out a reply. Who is this? No response. Minutes passed. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls had crept in while he wasn't paying attention. He checked the contact info. The number was Jake's, exactly as it had always been. But when he tried to call, the line went dead before a single ring. He checked his messages again. The previous texts were gone. His inbox empty. His pulse thundered in his ears. He could have sworn they had been there just moments ago. Ethan barely slept. The message looped in his mind, circling like a vulture, refusing to fade. Every possible explanation crumbled under its own weight. A prank would have made sense if the text had stayed. But they vanished. A number that still existed but couldn't be reached. A memory only Jake should have known. And then, the final message. I didn't put that there. A warning? A confession? Something else entirely? He didn't know. But the idea wormed into his thoughts, sinking its teeth in deep. The more he tried to ignore it, the more it pulled at him. By sunrise, he had already made his decision. The time capsule. He and Jake had buried it when they were kids. A stupid little ritual that was supposed to make them legends when they finally unearthed it years later. They had placed it behind Jake's old house, in a patch of woods near the creek, marking the spot with a rock they had spray-painted red. It was still there, untouched. The color had long since faded, but Ethan recognized the jagged edge, the small crack down the center. The ground was damp, loose enough to make digging easy. Each shovel strike sent a dull shock through his arms, but he barely noticed. Adrenaline drowned out the strain. 6 inches down, the tip of his shovel scraped against plastic. His breath hitched. Brushing away dirt with his hands, he uncovered the old tin lunchbox they had stuffed their childhood secrets into. The once bright cartoon characters on the surface had faded, rust creeping along the edges. He pried it open. Everything was still there. A deck of trading cards. A crumpled drawing of a spaceship. a cheap toy compass, a single crayon, blue, Jake's favorite color, and a handwritten note from each of them, folded and yellowed with age. But something else was there, too. A third note. The paper looked newer, whiter, out of place among the aged contents. The edges were crisp, untouched by time. Ethan unfolded it. They deeper. His fingers tightened around the paper. No, that wasn't possible. His stomach churned, a sickening wave of unease rising inside him. He hadn't written this. Neither had Jake. The paper trembled slightly in his grasp. He should have left. Stood up, walked away, pretended this never happened. But he couldn't, because some small, desperate part of him whispered that maybe, just maybe, Jake was still out there. And so he dug. The soil was wetter now, darker. The smell changed. It had the heavy, rancid weight of decay. The shovel struck something solid. Ethan froze. His hand shook as he scraped away the dirt. A shape began to emerge beneath the surface. Pale, wrinkled, a hand, severed at the wrist, curled as if still clinging to something in death. A phone, not a modern one. Old, a battered flip phone, half-crushed, smeared with dirt and something darker. His vision swam. The ground beneath him seemed to tilt, nausea rising fast. He staggered back, breath coming in short gasps. This wasn't possible. A rustling sound, a shift in the underbrush behind him. Something was watching. Ethan bolted. The shovel, the time capsule, even the phone. He left it all behind. Branches clawed at his arms. Roots threatened to trip him, but he didn't stop. Not until he was back in his car. Not until the engine roared to life. Not until he was speeding away, heart hammering in his chest. Home. He just needed to get home. His hands still caked with dirt. He fumbled for his phone, needing some kind of anchor to reality. A new message waited. Jake's number. Only 2 words. I didn't put that there. Ethan spent the drive home in silence, the engine's hum barely registering beneath the thunderous pounding in his ears. His thoughts scrambled, each one colliding with the next, none forming anything close to reason. The dirt on his hands had begun to dry, flaking off in patches, but the feeling of it, cold, damp, wrong, clung to him like a second skin. The severed hand, the phone, the note that shouldn't have been there, and then the message. I didn't put that there. His mind clawed for answers, for some logical explanation that didn't involve the impossible. Someone must have known about the time capsule. Someone had to be watching, waiting for him to dig it up, setting him up for what? A sick joke? Some elaborate mind game? Jake was gone. That was an undeniable fact. But the texts weren't. When he finally reached his apartment, he collapsed onto the couch, barely able to steady his shaking hands long enough to unlock his phone. There was only one thing left to do. He called Jake's parents. His voice cracked as he forced the words out, trying to sound casual, normal. He asked if they still had Jake's phone. The answer was immediate. Jake's phone had been buried with him. His mother had insisted. It had been placed in the coffin before the funeral, right beside him, just like she wanted. Ethan barely mumbled a response before ending the call. His phone should have been buried, under 6 feet of dirt, locked in a coffin. But he had seen it today, had touched it, and yet his own phone still buzzed with messages from Jake's number. That night, sleep never came. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every shadow in the room stretching impossibly long, as if something unseen lurked just outside his vision. His body refused to relax, every nerve wound tight, waiting. It happened at 3:12 a.m. A single message. Pick up. Ethan's chest tightened. He sat up, fingers gripping the sheets. The room had turned colder, the air thick, oppressive. His phone vibrated in his hands. The screen flashed with an incoming call. Jake's name. Ethan's breath stilled. For a long, paralyzing moment, he simply watched it ring. The name burned against the darkness, impossible and wrong. He should have let it go to voicemail. He should have thrown the phone across the room. But his thumb moved on its own, pressing the screen before he could stop himself. The call connected. Silence. Not the kind of silence that meant no one was there. This was something else. Something heavy. A presence pressing against his skull, suffocating, thick with expectation. Then breathing. Ragged. Uneven. Something wet caught in the back of a throat. Not Jake. The realization hit like ice water through his veins. The sound deepened, distorted, warping in ways a human voice shouldn't. Static crackled, the interference splitting through the noise like a blade. Then words, fragmented, twisted. Not Jake. Help me. The line went dead. Ethan pulled the phone away from his ear, his hands trembling. His breath came in short, rapid bursts, but the world around him felt frozen, suffocating. His call log blinked up at him. The call had lasted 0 seconds. No time stamp. No record. Like it had never happened at all. Ethan had always considered himself a rational person. He wasn't the kind to believe in ghosts, curses, or anything beyond what could be explained with logic. But logic had abandoned him. There was no explanation for the calls. No reason why Jake's number, buried 6 feet under, was still reaching out to him. No way to rationalize the severed hand clutching an identical phone. Not Jake. Help me. The word from the call had not left his mind. There was something trapped in this nightmare with him. And if he wanted answers, he had only one place left to go. Jake's grave. The cemetery sat on the outskirts of town, tucked behind rows of old oak trees. At this hour, it was empty. The streetlights didn't reach past the iron gates, leaving the rows of headstones bathed in shadows. Ethan parked at the far end of the lot and killed the engine. His hands trembled as he stepped out, shovel slung over his shoulder. The air was heavy with damp earth and the faint scent of decaying leaves. Jake's grave wasn't hard to find. The headstone was simple, his full name etched into the stone beneath the words "gone too soon." Ethan stood there for a long time, hesitating. Once he started, there was no going back. He drove the shovel into the soil. The first few strikes were easy, the ground loose from recent rain. But as he dug deeper, the effort became harder. Sweat mixed with dirt on his skin, breath coming in ragged gasps. The deeper he went, the more he felt the weight of what he was doing pressing against his ribs like an iron vise. Then, the metallic scrape. The coffin. He swallowed hard, hands unsteady as he brushed away the last layer of soil. The lid was smooth, undisturbed, exactly as it had been when they buried him, except for the faint smears of dirt along the edges, as if it had been opened before. His breath hitched, gripping the edge of the lid. He hesitated for only a moment before pushing it open. Empty. No body. No sign that one had ever been there. Only one thing sat inside. Jake's phone. The screen was cracked, the casing scratched as if it had been through hell. The battery was drained, the display dark. But when Ethan picked it up, it was warm. Fresh. As if someone had just been holding it. The world tilted. His heart pounded against his ribs, nausea rising like bile. Jake wasn't here. The realization was slow, creeping, cold as death itself. A vibration in his pocket shattered the silence. Ethan fumbled for his phone, his fingers slick with sweat and dirt. The screen glowed in the darkness. A new message. Jake's number. Not the only one buried. His pulse thundered in his ears. His skin prickled with a terrible, primal knowing, something worse than fear. Another vibration. An attachment. His breath caught in his throat as he opened it. A photo. Grainy, dark, but clear enough to make out. A gravestone. His own name carved into the stone. His birth date. And a death date. Tomorrow. Ethan's breath came in short, ragged gasps as he stared at the photo. His name. His birth date. And a death date that hadn't happened yet. Tomorrow. The cold spread through his body, creeping into his bones, turning his limbs numb. This had to be a trick, a hoax. Someone had doctored the image, manipulated it to look real. But the graveyard in the picture, it was familiar. The cracked pathway, the gnarled tree looming over the rows of headstones. It was here, a few yards away. His feet moved before his mind could stop them. He staggered across the uneven ground, eyes locked onto the rows of graves, searching, heart hammering against his ribs. And then he saw it, the same headstone from the picture. His name, carved deep into the stone. The numbers beneath it, mocking him. His death had already been written. Ethan stumbled back, his vision blurring. His breath hitched in his throat as the world around him seemed to stretch and twist, bending at the edges like something unreal. The night air pressed against his skin, suffocating, thick with something wrong. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. He turned and ran. Branches clawed at his arms as he pushed through the trees, feet pounding against the pavement when he finally reached his car. He barely registered starting the engine, barely noticed the road blurring past him as he sped home. His apartment came into view like an oasis, the only thing that felt solid, grounding. He threw open the door, chest heaving, and stumbled inside. Everything looked the same. The couch, the cluttered coffee table, the half-drunk cup of coffee from this morning. But the air felt different, heavy, as if something else was in the room with him. Ethan's legs nearly gave out beneath him as he made his way to the bathroom. He had to see his own reflection, had to prove he was still here, still real. He flicked on the light. The mirror reflected him back, his face pale, his eyes hollowed by exhaustion and fear. But something wasn't right. His hands trembled as he lifted his phone, opening the camera. He steadied himself, aimed the lens at the mirror, and took a photo. The screen blinked. The image loaded. Nothing. No reflection. Just an empty room. A sharp, choking gasp tore from his throat. The phone slipped from his grip, clattering against the sink. His legs backed him away from the mirror, but the truth had already sunk in. He wasn't real. The messages, the empty coffin, the grave with his name, a vibration in his pocket, a final text. You've been dead since the accident, Ethan. I've been trying to wake you up. His vision darkened at the edges. The room around him seemed to crack, splintering apart like fragile glass. The air itself rippled, shifting, pulling away. His phone screen flickered violently. A deep, splintering sound erupted from within as the glass fractured, spreading outwards in jagged lines. The cracks pulsed, spreading beyond the screen, moving across the walls, the ceiling. Everything was breaking. The world collapsed around him. The last thing he heard was his own breath, ragged, shallow, fading. And then, nothing. Darkness. A gasp. Ethan's lungs burned as he jolted awake, sucking in stale air. His hands clawed at the darkness around him, but his arms struck something solid. Wood. Enclosed. Tight. He tried to move, but there was no space. The walls were inches from his face, pressing in on all sides. The air was thin, suffocating, heavy with damp earth. His phone vibrated against his chest. His fingers fumbled for it, shaking, desperate. The screen flickered weakly in the darkness. One final message. You should have answered sooner.